In the night of December 14th, 2019, the life of the Cole family changed forever. David Cole, 24 years old, heir to a billion-dollar business empire, walked out of a hotel lounge and vanished into the night. 2 hours later, his family's phone rang. The voice on the other end said David's life depended on one thing: $2 million in cash. But what no one knew that night was that this wasn't just a kidnapping. It was the beginning of something far darker. The Lakeside Grand Hotel was the crown jewel of the city's winter season. That night, its glittering lobby and grand ballroom were alive with warmth and light. The annual Winter Gala had drawn the city's elite: CEOs, politicians, celebrities, all gathered under a ceiling of crystal chandeliers. Snow drifted down outside, caught in the glow of the street lamps. David Cole arrived just after 8 o'clock, stepping from a black SUV into the cold December air. Photographers turned, cameras flashing. He smiled easily, greeting a few familiar faces before disappearing into the golden light of the lobby. Inside, David moved with the ease of someone who had grown up among power and wealth. He shook hands with old friends of the family, exchanged polite words with business associates, laughed at small jokes. Nothing about his demeanor hinted at trouble. By all accounts, he seemed entirely at ease, enjoying the evening, making conversation, never showing the slightest sign of unease. But at 9:45 p.m., something changed. Witnesses recalled David leaning across his table and saying, "I'll be right back. Just need some air." He stood, smoothed his jacket, and walked toward the back of the lounge. Security footage shows him leaving the main hall, passing through a wide corridor where two hotel staff members were moving trays of champagne. He nodded to them politely before turning into a narrow service hallway. 1 minute later, another man entered that hallway. He wore a dark jacket, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. The cameras never captured a clear image of him. Then, without warning, the footage cut to static. At 10:30 p.m., the Cole family's private phone line rang. Sarah Cole, David's older sister, answered. The voice on the other end was calm, deliberate, a man's voice slightly distorted. "We have David. $2 million. Cash. No police. You have 24 hours. If you call them, you'll never see him again." Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to keep him talking, to ask where David was, whether he was hurt. But the line went dead. Her father, Richard Cole, reacted instantly. He reached for his phone to call the police, but Sarah stopped him. "They said no police," she told him urgently. "If they're watching us, it could get him killed." Richard's voice rose in frustration. "And if we do nothing, what then?" She made a decision, not to call the police, but to reach out to Detective Mark Lewis, a family friend she had known since childhood. Mark arrived within 30 minutes. Tall, slightly unshaven, his coat collar turned up against the cold, he carried himself with the weary calm of someone who had seen far worse. He studied the ransom details twice, then a third time. "This isn't just ransom," he said quietly. "This is personal." Sarah told him everything she could remember about that night. David's mood, his sudden decision to step outside, the call that followed. When she mentioned a service hallway, Mark's eyes flickered with interest. Around midnight, an envelope was slipped under the Cole family's front door. Inside was a typed message in bold, block letters. It repeated the ransom demand, but it ended with 6 words that chilled Sarah to the bone. "David isn't who you think he is." Mark returned to the hotel. He spoke with David's friends. All of them repeated the same story. David had gone outside for air. Reviewing the security footage, Mark saw the same thing Sarah had been told. David walking into the service hallway, the man in the cap following. Then the outage. The camera stayed dark for exactly 2 minutes. When they came back online, both men were gone. The nearest exit from that hallway led to a rear loading dock, and beyond that, a frozen parking lot. At the Cole home, Sarah's phone rang again. The number was unfamiliar. She hesitated, then answered. "You want David back. Stop looking for him." The call lasted only seconds, but Sarah was certain she had heard that voice before. At 5:30 a.m., a package was delivered to the hotel's front desk. It had no return address. Inside was David's watch, still ticking. Wrapped around the strap was a strip of paper. On it was a single word: choose. Detective Mark Lewis turned the strip of paper over in his hands. There was only one word printed in bold, black ink: choose. He stared at it for a moment, rolling the word over in his mind. Choose what? Sarah leaned forward, her voice breaking through his thoughts. What do they mean? Choose between paying them or calling the police. Mark didn't answer right away. He'd seen ransom notes before, crude demands, rushed handwriting, desperate ultimatums. But this wasn't like those. This note didn't read like a threat. It read like a challenge, a game. And games meant the kidnappers were in control. Back at the hotel, Mark sat in the security office, eyes fixed on the glowing screen in front of him. Hours of surveillance footage flickered past. Then, at 9:40 p.m., just 5 minutes before David left the gala, a black SUV pulled into the alley beside the loading dock. The driver never got out. Tinted windows concealed everything inside. The plates were missing. And then, as silently as it had arrived, it was gone. At 3:15 that afternoon, Mark's personal cell phone rang. The number was blocked. He answered, but there was no voice on the other end. Instead, a recording began to play. The muffled crash of waves in the background. Then David's voice, urgent, almost panicked. "Sarah, listen to me." Static swallowed the rest. The line went dead. Mark called in a favor from an old friend in the financial crimes unit. Within hours, they uncovered something unusual. 2 months before the kidnapping, David had opened a private bank account under a false name. Into that account, he had quietly transferred exactly $2 million, the exact amount the kidnappers were demanding. When Mark told Sarah, she stared at him, stunned. "You think he's part of this? That he staged his own kidnapping?" Mark's voice was steady. "I'm saying, if someone already has the money, then the ransom demand might be a cover for something else entirely." Later, Mark tracked down a homeless man who sometimes slept near the hotel's loading dock. The man claimed that around 10 p.m., he had seen 2 figures leading someone toward a black SUV. But the victim wasn't struggling. In fact, he walked to the car willingly. That night, another envelope appeared on the Cole family's doorstep. Inside was a photograph, grainy but unmistakable. David sat at a small cafe table. Across from him was a woman with dark hair, smiling at him like they shared a secret. On the back of the photo, in block letters, was a single message: "She's worth more than $2 million." Mark studied the woman's face. There was something about her, something he couldn't place at first. Then it clicked. 5 years ago, she had been linked to a string of high-profile fraud cases. She was a con artist, one of the best, and she had disappeared just before she could be arrested. And now, she was with David Cole. At 11:45 that night, Sarah's phone rang again. This time, the voice on the other end was clear. "Calm, steady. Sarah," David said, "stop looking for me. I'm not coming home." The call ended. The line went dead, but the voice clung to Thomas Cole's thoughts, low, deliberate, without an ounce of hesitation. The words repeated in his mind like a curse. "We have your son. Do not call the police, or you will never see him again." Thomas sat frozen in the dim glow of his study, staring at the receiver in his trembling hand. His knuckles were bone white against the black bakelite, and for a man who had built an empire with ruthless decisiveness, the transformation was almost cruel. The titan who could crush boardroom opposition with a glance now felt small, powerless, unsure how to even draw his next breath. It was 8:14 p.m. on a chilly Tuesday night in March, and the city outside carried on as if nothing had shifted. Street lamps hummed along Fifth Avenue. Somewhere far off, a taxi horn cut through the night. In 100 warm apartments, people poured drinks, opened newspapers, spoke casually over dinner, oblivious to the fact that somewhere in the city, a young man's life hung by a thread. Despite the threat, Thomas acted almost instantly. He reached for a second phone line, the one nearly no one knew about, and dialed a number burned into his memory. 15 minutes later, 2 unmarked sedans eased to a stop outside the townhouse. Men stepped out, their overcoats snapping in the wind, their eyes sharp against the dark. These were detectives from the NYPD's Major Crimes Unit. The lead investigator, Mark Grayson, carried the presence of someone who had stared down the impossible and walked away with answers. His gaze swept the study in a single practiced motion. The untouched whiskey glass on the desk, the still swaying cord of the telephone, the stiff back posture of a father refusing to fold. Thomas recounted the call exactly as it had been spoken, stripping it of all emotion as if by doing so he could keep his son alive through sheer precision. Grayson listened, expression unreadable, before signaling his partner. Within minutes, the quiet order of the townhouse gave way to subtle preparations. Recording devices hidden in the library, wires running discreetly along baseboards, the promise of a plan forming in real time. Across the city, David Cole sat in a cold, airless room without windows. His wrists burned from the rough cord, digging deeper every time he moved. A single bulb swayed above, casting a pale circle that failed to warm the space. Outside the door, voices murmured in low argument. Two men. One called the other Barry. David clung to that name like a scrap of cloth in a storm. If his father was still alive and fighting for him, he knew Thomas Cole would stop at nothing. The question was whether the men holding him understood that. Back at the Cole townhouse, the telephone rang again. The sound seemed to pin every man in the room to the floor. Thomas answered, his voice tight but steady. A flat, distorted tone told him the price. $250,000, small bills, non-sequential, ready by midnight the next night. Instructions would follow. Police involvement would mean David's death. Thomas demanded to hear his son's voice. A pause followed, then the sound of movement, and finally David's voice, strained and urgent. "Dad, just..." The line snapped off before he could finish. Grayson moved quickly. Teams were dispatched to monitor banks for unusual withdrawals, while others began combing through phone records. There had been a faint background hum in the call, something electrical, perhaps a transformer, perhaps high-voltage lines, that could be narrowed down. It was Sarah, standing pale in the doorway, who noticed what everyone else had missed. She remembered hearing a voice like that at one of David's charity events the previous winter. A man in his mid-30s with brown hair, watching David the entire evening. It was the first sign that this kidnapping was no random strike. By morning, the story was everywhere. The front page of a New York Herald screamed about the abduction, and reporters swarmed outside the Cole residence. The foyer flashed with the constant pop of cameras. Sarah found herself speaking for the family, her voice soft and trembling as she fed the media just enough to keep them from digging deeper. Meanwhile, in the cold room, David tried to free himself. Waiting until Barry was gone, he scraped his bonds against a jagged nail protruding from the wall. Minutes dragged like hours, each fiber snapping one at a time, until he began to see hope in the fraying strands. Then footsteps came. The door opened. The man who entered was not Barry. He was taller, gaunt, with eyes like glass shards. The look on his face carried no patience. The blow landed before David could form a single word, and the world folded into black. That night, at 11:42, the kidnappers called again. Thomas was instructed to deliver the cash to a bus depot locker in Jersey City by 3 in the morning. He was to come alone. Grayson allowed it to appear as if the demand would be met, but behind the scenes, an unmarked van shadowed the trip. Officers blended into the depot crowd, watching, waiting. When Thomas opened the locker, it was empty. This hadn't been an exchange. It had been a test, a way for the kidnappers to measure his obedience. Grayson began to suspect what Thomas already feared. The abduction wasn't purely about ransom. The Cole name had weight in circles where grudges festered for years. Rivals in politics, enemies in business, deals gone wrong in dark rooms. And now, Sarah admitted something new. That weeks before his disappearance, David had confessed to feeling followed. He had laughed it off then, but it was clear now the shadow had been real. 2 days had passed since the abduction. The ransom remained unpaid. Somewhere in the city, David Cole waited in the dark, his mind scraping together fragments of sound and memory. And in those fragments, he was beginning to piece together something far more dangerous than captivity. He was recognizing the voice of one of his captors. It was a voice he had once trusted. David Cole's ordeal had begun the moment the blindfold came off. He sat in the dim light of a small, drafty cabin somewhere far from the glittering world he'd grown up in. The air was cold enough to make his fingers numb where the rope bit into his wrists. Every breath carried the musty scent of wood that hadn't been cared for in years, and each creak in the floor reminded him he wasn't alone. The man who seemed to be in charge was young, early 20s, with a restless energy he couldn't hide. His foot tapped on the floor as he paced, his eyes darting from David to the door as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. "Once we get the cash," the man said, his voice clipped and shaky, "you'll be home. No one gets hurt, understand?" David gave the smallest nod. He didn't trust his voice, didn't trust what might slip out. In the movies, hostages sometimes talk their way free. In real life, he knew words could just as easily make things worse. Time in that cabin was a strange, punishing thing. Minutes stretched like hours, hours blurred into something that felt like days. Outside, the occasional sound of a passing car teased him with a reminder that freedom might be just beyond those thin walls. But the neighborhood, if it could even be called that, was too quiet, almost as if it had been chosen for that reason. One of the captors, a man with softer eyes than the rest, took a small risk. He handed David a cup of water, the rim cold against David's lips. "You'll be out of here soon, kid," he murmured. "Just sit tight." David wanted to believe it, but he'd already learned that in situations like this, every kind word could be just another thread in a larger lie. While he sat in that cabin, the Cole estate was suffocating under its own silence. The FBI had taken over. Agents in dark suits moved from room to room. Radios crackled. Phones rang briefly before being snatched up. Everyone was waiting for the one call that would tell them how to bring David home. That call finally came with instructions for the ransom drop. The kidnappers had been crystal clear. No trackers, no hidden devices, no police interference. But the FBI wasn't about to simply hand over the money without some kind of safeguard. In quiet, tense conversations, they debated their options. In the end, it was David's father who broke the deadlock. He would follow the kidnappers' demands exactly. He wasn't interested in clever tricks. He wanted his son back alive, and he wanted it now. That night, at precisely 9:30 p.m., Mr. Cole drove alone to a desolate stretch of highway. He carried the ransom in 2 heavy cases. The headlights of an approaching car blinked twice, an agreed signal, before going dark. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, quick, and silent. They lifted the cases into their vehicle, then melted back into the night without a single word exchanged. The FBI had cars ready to follow. They kept their distance, trying not to spook the kidnappers. But the winding back roads, the sudden turns, and the complete absence of streetlights worked in the criminals' favor. Within minutes, the trail was gone. 2 hours later, far from the Cole estate, headlights cut across the cracked asphalt outside a lonely service station. A car slowed just enough for the rear door to swing open. David Cole stumbled out, his legs unsteady, the night air biting at his face. His hands were free now. He turned back toward the car, but before he could catch a glimpse of the driver's face, it sped away into the darkness. Inside the service station, a stunned attendant recognized him instantly. A phone call to the police brought the FBI racing to the scene. They took David into protective custody before whisking him home. When father and son finally stood face to face, there were no speeches, no dramatic declarations. They simply embraced. The kind of embrace that says everything words cannot. The relief, the exhaustion, and the quiet knowledge that life could have ended very differently. The FBI didn't leave empty-handed. In one of the ransom cases, they had hidden a microscopic tracking device the kidnappers had overlooked. It hadn't stayed with the money for long. It was tossed into a trash bin somewhere along the escape route, but it was enough to give investigators a partial trail. Over the next 2 days, agents worked relentlessly, following the flow of ransom bills as they began to surface in scattered locations. A Las Vegas casino cashier's window, a liquor store register in Southern California, a bus station vending machine. Those bills led them to a name, Barry Keenan. He wasn't a stranger. In fact, he had once been a familiar face in the Hollywood social circles David had brushed against. Keenan was young, brash, and drowning in debt. To him, kidnapping the son of a famous entertainer wasn't just a crime. It was a calculated investment. But Keenan hadn't worked alone. Joe Amsler and John Irwin had been part of the plan from the beginning, each taking a role in the abduction, the transport, the ransom drop. It didn't take long for the FBI to track them all down. Keenan was the first to be arrested. Agents found him at his apartment, stacks of ransom money hidden in boxes, his confidence still unshaken. When they read him his rights, he almost grinned, as though he thought the story would somehow end in his favor. The trial shattered that illusion. From the first day in court, it was clear this would be more than a legal proceeding. It was theater. Reporters filled every bench, notebooks ready, pens scratching down each word. Artists sketched the faces of the accused, capturing every flicker of expression. The defense spun a strange theory, that David had gone with them willingly, that this was a kind of stunt gone awry, something between a prank and a publicity scheme. David sat in the witness stand and told the jury what it was really like. The ropes, the constant threat hanging over him, the fear that at any moment something could happen to make his captors change their minds. He spoke quietly, but the truth in his voice cut through the defense like glass. The jury took little time in delivering their verdict. All three men were convicted. The judge's gavel came down with finality, the echo filling the courtroom like the last note of a long, dissonant song. David went back to his music career, but people close to him noticed the difference. He traveled less. Crowds made him uneasy. He avoided certain roads at night. The kind of fear that burrows deep is not one that ever fully leaves. As for the ransom, Mr. Cole never said publicly how much was recovered. Whispers claimed a portion was never found, slipping quietly into the underworld's bloodstream. The Cole kidnapping became a story told again and again, not just for the crime itself, but for the boldness of attempting it in an era when people still thought certain families were untouchable. It was a reminder that no one, no matter how wealthy or beloved, was beyond the reach of desperation and greed. Sometimes, the richest notes are the ones you never want to hear. A phone ringing in the night, a voice on the other end, steady and cold, saying only, "We have your boy." Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos.